Aside from the Smash Ball and the Assist Trophy, my favorite item in Smash Bros. Is the Beam Sword. Now many of you would say that this is a lightsaber. In Star Wars, the lightsaber requires the Force. In Super Smash Bros., there is no Force involved with the Beam Sword. And that's pretty much the only difference. It makes more sense to call it a Beam Sword because a lightsaber isn't anything like an actual saber, which is a heavy curved sword wielded by cavalry. In fact, the lightsaber has a straight blade that doesn't curve at all, not even like a katana. In this video, I will talk about how a beam sword works, and tell you a bit about its history. Now let me get some misconceptions out of the way. First off, it is not a laser sword. They have nothing to do with lasers. The blade is a beam of plasma contained in a force field. The force field is what prevents the heat of the beam from melting the hilt and burning the hands. And another thing to point out is that the crystal does not power the beam sword. Although the focusing crystal is the most important component of the beam sword, it is not the power source. It's not even an energy crystal. Energy crystals, like quartz and sugar, they're piezoelectric, which means you have to squeeze it and it lets out a bit of electricity. But electricity alone would not be nearly enough energy to power a beam sword. That's why you can't run it on batteries. It would have to be a nuclear fuel cell in the back of the hilt. That nuclear fuel cell is surrounded by the power field conductor, along with the power vortex rings. Both of these help the energy flow up the fuel rod and into the crystal chamber. The crystal chamber usually holds 1 to 3 crystals inside. Having more crystals can make it easier to change the length and thickness of the blade. The focusing crystals can be naturally found or made synthetically. Now while it's mostly crystals that the beam sword uses, on some occasions they use ancient artifacts, physical remains, mechanical devices, or even shards of glass, as long as they channel the energy in the same way as the crystals. Once the energy is converted by the crystals, it flows through the blade energy channel. Next to it are the cycling field energizers. One directs the energy to flow up the channel into the emitter, while the other recycles it back to the power supply. The knobs you see on the sides of the hilt control the energy modulation circuits. These are for adjusting the length and thickness of the blade. The magnetic stabilizing ring completes the circuit and maintains the force field so that the plasma remains in its iconic shape, and when a beam sword clashes another, it doesn't pass right through. If you are making a beam sword, do be careful, for if you set up the matrix incorrectly, turning it on will cause a massive explosion, with all that's left being the crystal. Case in point, always make sure the emitter matrix is set up correctly every time you work on the sword. The history of the beam sword can be traced back to imbued weapons. Weapons have been imbued with magic and PSI. Examples include the Binding Blade, the Soul Caddy, the Siegfried, the Fujin Yumi, the Masked Man's Sword, and the Sword of Kings. You might be asking, how do I know the Sword of Kings is a PSI imbued weapon? Well, only Pooh can wield that sword, which means that only he can unlock the sword's true potential. Also note that where the sword is found is likely where the Starmen were examining the sword, trying to figure out how to harness its iconic power, so they could channel their PSI through a physical weapon. In fact, that's likely how Porky learned to make the Masked Man's sword. After imbued weapons, the first beam swords had to be plugged into a power pack. This was risky, because if that cord were to break, the blade would go out and leave you open to the enemy's attack. Eventually, the beam sword was engineered to run on a single fuel rod inside the hilt, and that's the one we have today. Now I could go on and on about all the different types of beam swords there are, but that's a video for another day. So until next time, I'll see you later.